Hi, Keithlin and Nicholas. Sorry, give me a moment while I iron out some technical issues.
Hi, Keithlin and Nicholas. Yeah, we'll be starting either at 9 or we'll wait till about maybe 15 people join us. So we'll see which one comes first. Yeah.
Sure, no problem.
Yep, fine.
So yeah, how are you both? What's been like the main thing you guys have been doing so far?
Sorry, Brandon, was that directed to us?
Yeah, I was just asking, yeah, how are you both, and like what have you been busy with so far?
Nicholas, do you want to go ahead? Or should I go first?
Go first. Go first.
Just it's been a whirlwind since COVID. I mean, obviously, I'm in the agricultural sphere, so we've had to pivot our business model a bit. Um, and yeah, it's just been an ongoing cycle. We just finished a training program, a virtual training program for farmers. Now we're doing like a membership drive and so on. Um, so yeah, it's just been really busy. What about you?
So yes, it's been more busy for our partners than for ourselves. I mean, they've all had to adapt their programs and how to take them online. So and most of them have adapted quite well, actually. I mean, some already had a significantly digital component to their training development programs, and some were complete neophytes. So that's been a challenge, and simply being able to insert themselves into being a useful and helpful presence to the entrepreneurs they work with. Obviously, themselves are having to cope with various different levels of change that's going forward. So, so it's been a very challenging time for them. In fact, our lives have somehow slowed down, actually. We can't go and visit any of our organizations. So so that's taken whole chunks of time out, which you would normally have had. So it's a curious mixture, really.
Okay, yeah, she's quite interesting. I've been kind of like involved with a like youth social entrepreneurship education program, and we actually featured green gold as one of the examples in one of our lessons, just because we are teaching about human-centered design. So since I had like your case studies on hand, so I decided to use it for just teaching about how to, you know, incorporate some of that in their own social enterprises. So that's been quite interesting. Yeah. Actually, I think some of those students that we taught during that pilot program that we did will probably be attending this webinar. So it'll be, I think, quite interesting for them to just see the social entrepreneur behind the lessons that they've been taking. Yeah.
I see. Because I did wonder why we were chosen. So now I know.
Yeah. I guess for me, I just wanted to have a like two, like I wouldn't say different, but just perspectives from social entrepreneur, like someone who's very actively involved in her own social enterprise right now, and Nicholas coming from more of like an ecosystem perspective, like our speakers for today. Yeah. Yep, we have like quite a few participants in the waiting room now, so we'll be letting them in, and we'll probably start around 9:05 or maybe like 9:10 latest. Yeah. Hi everyone, thanks for joining. We're just waiting for a few people. We'll probably start at about 9:05. Okay, hi everyone, thanks for coming. I think we'll be starting now, and we'll just be adding the people who come late a bit later. So yeah, thanks for coming. Today we're just gonna have a conversation with both Keithlin and Nicholas about some themes and trends within social entrepreneurship. Yeah. So here are the main two prompts that we're going to be tackling today. So first, we're looking at the current state of social enterprises in terms of how their growth models allow for inclusive growth and how that might complement some of the more top-down approaches to development that we see internationally and regionally, and also the challenges social enterprises face and how social enterprises are delivering impact during this pandemic. And next, looking to the future, we want to look at how people in the ecosystem and the social sector can support social enterprises, and also how social enterprises can complement non-profits and vice versa. And finally, we want to look at how students and youths can approach social entrepreneurship and how they can contribute to this movement globally. Yeah, so just a quick introduction on Bridges for Enterprise. We were founded in 2015. And since then, we've been working with about 64 social enterprise startups from 21 countries. We have 3 main chapters based in Singapore, Cambridge, and New York. And we work with a lot of university society partners, we have a lot of corporate partners, and we're just aiming to be a bridge for social enterprises to connect them with professional networks and take them through an incubation period. Yeah. So this is the main overview of our program. We provide a 6 to 12 month incubation with the following services. We help social enterprises with researching business strategies, with maybe doing up pitch decks, for some legal advice, as well as technical advisory. So yeah, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. So Keith Lin has been working with the UN in many capacities, including the Office of Peacekeeping and Strategic Partnerships and Mediation Support Unit. And the main way we've engaged with Keith Lin is actually in her work with Helen's Daughters, as well as Green Gold. So we've worked with her in some incubation programs and also some engagements. And what she has done is very inspiring. She has worked with many women farmers to help them become more visible within the market and help them with many capacity development efforts. So I think it'd be very good to hear from her insights on social entrepreneurship. Next, we'll be speaking also with Nicholas, who is the director of the Argidius Foundation, a family foundation that has been working a lot in advancing enterprise development in mainly the African and Latin American region. So I really enjoyed speaking to one of the fund managers at Argidius, and just want to learn more about the way they approach enterprise development. And I think it'll be very good to speak with him today. So yeah, without further ado, I'd like to start off with our first question. So I'm just here to kind of unpack how social enterprises are actually fostering sustainable and inclusive growth. So I'll actually like to bring this question first to Keith Lin. So I understand that agriculture has always been a very integral part of your life, and your social enterprise and non-profit organization, Helen's Daughters and Green Gold, actively empowers women farmers through capacity development. So I'd just like to hear about your theory of change model, as well as your recent initiatives that have helped to empower rural women farmers in St. Lucia.
Thank you so much, Brandon, for the question, and thank you to BfE for actually hosting this webinar. I think that for me, social enterprise is quite a new thing because coming from Latin America and the Caribbean in particular, social enterprise is really a new phenomenon. In my country of St. Lucia, for example, it's unheard of, and even sort of trying to register an organization like that, you sort of have to tweak your way for people to really understand what a social enterprise is, which is why we have 2 components. We have the nonprofit side, which is Helen's Daughters, and we have the social enterprise side, which is Green Gold. And in this instance, Helen's Daughters is more or less a training program for rural women to develop their capacity and knowledge in sustainable agricultural practices and so on, and refining their enterprise goals. And Green Gold is technically the end goal, which is creating market linkages so that these women could actually achieve sustainable incomes by being connected with hotels and restaurants and so on. And for us, to answer your first question, Brandon, why social enterprises are able to foster sustainable and inclusive growth for us, particularly in St. Lucia. While agriculture is at the heart of of our economy, well, once was. It's still often overlooked, to be honest with you. We're particularly focused on the tourism industry. And in many ways, because of that, you find that the Ministry of Agriculture has not really kept up with if modern agricultural practices and really engaging with smallholder farmers. And I think that is where social enterprises like us and others come in, because we're really actually the link between the smallholder farmers and the large scale buyers. To give you an example, St. Lucia, for example, had what you would call an agricultural marketing unit where farmers would normally sell their produce at a large scale, and the Ministry of Agriculture would take charge of that unit and then resell their produce to hotels, restaurants, and so on. But about 10 years ago, that unit closed off, and it doesn't seem like it's going to open at any time. So for us, it was a weakness in the infrastructure in terms of the Ministry of Agriculture, but also a strength in that we're able to foster those linkages ourselves. I hope that's okay, Brandon, my answer, or did you want me to elaborate on any aspect?
No, I think that's great. Just wondering if you had there's some slides that you wanted to share.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, you could share my slide for sure, so that everyone could have an idea of a background of what I'm talking about and so on.
Yeah, the slides are here. Yeah.
Particularly the 5th slide. Exactly. Yes. So again, as I had mentioned, we literally, because of our legal structure and so on in St. Lucia, we have a nonprofit and we have a social enterprise, and they both complement one another. Another thing that I forgot to mention in terms of basically like allowing complementing traditional approaches to development is that the food importation bill is a huge problem in St. Lucia and in the Caribbean at large. For us on our island, we spend about $360 million in food every year for a population of about 170,000 persons. So that's it's sort of outrageous, the food import bill, particularly when half of that food can be grown locally in St. Lucia. And again, it comes to the onus on the Ministry of Agriculture, but we can't always rely on ministries or government and so on for their intervention. And that's where organizations like us come on. We allow the farmers to understand what to grow, what's in demand, to understand how to sort of bypass gluts and shortages in the island, to find the end buyers, and to also empower rural women farmers who usually don't see themselves as agricultural entrepreneurs. So yes, you'll see the breakdown of our key service offerings, like our information service and crop monitoring, our online produce marketplace, quality assessment, and so on. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So I think now we'll go to Nicholas. Yeah, I mean, we hear a lot about, like, from many of these big reports from like the UN or maybe the Schwab Foundation about how social entrepreneurship is like the way forward for encouraging inclusive job growth and market failure. And solving market failure. I just wanted to get a perspective from you, someone who's worked with many enterprises on the ground, to get a more grounded perspective of how true that is. Yeah.
Well, I think first the enterprise piece, and then I'll talk about the social enterprise piece. So the enterprise piece, if you want to know what's the single best indicator of somebody moving from poverty out of poverty, it's when they get waged, salaried job in the formal sector. And the driver of creating that level of employment falls to small and growing businesses, a subsection of which are social enterprises. So the more productive, small, growing enterprises that you create, you will begin to address that huge demographic employment challenge. So go to Kenya, for example, each year about 700,000 people join the workforce. Currently, the economy creates only 75,000 formal jobs every year. So that's only 10% of the people, and the rest go into the informal sector, which are relatively low paid, relatively low productivity, insecure employment activities. And so changing those dynamics is very important. And so that's why enterprise. And then why social enterprise? Because social enterprise adds another significant wrapper around that, because it's trying to find and address market and institutional and social failures which require innovation to develop new models. So one of the businesses we've worked with in Uganda is called Impact Water. The Impact Water provides solar-powered water treatment facilities for schools. So it's enabled 1 million school children in Uganda to have access to clean drinking water at relatively low cost, using a technology that isn't very sophisticated in point of fact. Actually, the sophistication has probably been in the financial modeling of enabling the schools to pay relatively small amounts over time in order to incorporate these facilities into each school at each time. And so they're something that might have been a public policy infrastructure project costing a very large amount of money, being very bureaucratic, being very slow, has been addressed by a nimble social enterprise, which is now expanding to Kenya and Uganda. Solving a particular challenge around access to clean drinking water when you're at school. So it's that combination of looking at gaps in the market, looking at where either the public or the private sector has failed to address a particular need, and coming up with an innovative solution, which in this case was actually a financial modeling solution rather than a technical solution, because the product is relatively straightforward and well known. So it's those kinds of things I think that social enterprise does and can do very well.
Okay. Just another question, just to follow up. Like, we hear a lot about human-centered design. I guess that's something that we hear a lot around social entrepreneurship. For both you and Keithlin, like, have you used this concept in your work, like for Keithlin? And in terms of Nicholas, like, can you name some of the social enterprises within your ecosystem that actually follow these principles a lot in terms of iterating their product and just working with their consumers to make sure that their product really fits the social goals?
Hi, Brandon. Can you repeat the first part of your question? You were cracking up a bit.
Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah, I was just asking, we hear a lot about the concept of human-centered design, designing the product for the recipient's needs and making sure that they're able to use it properly. And I think that's a large part of sustainable growth. So I was just wondering if you have applied that concept kind of like actively in your social entrepreneurship work.
Okay, great. Nicholas, would you like to go first or should I?
No, you go ahead.
Okay. That's actually a great question. For us in St. Lucia and in the Caribbean, like I mentioned with our food importation bill, what we've noticed now is that we linked we have also a high number of rates of non-communicable diseases such as hypertension, diabetes, high cholesterol, and so on. And we linked those NCDs a lot of times to the foods that's imported in our countries. And what we're noticing now, quite a bit of our end consumers and so on are talking about those NCDs. They're becoming more health conscious, more aware of where their food is coming from and so on. And in turn, we're also seeing that, and also there's obviously a big push for organic produce and so on. And in turn, we're starting to educate our own farmers on this. For example, the use of pesticides, which used to be a big thing in St. Lucia, understanding how to go organic and the time frame that comes from that. Two, another thing is educating both sides of the spectrum, the buyers and also the growers on the types of food that they grow and the nutrition of these foods. One good example would be, for example, we grow ground provisions like dasheen and so on, which is actually very high in fiber and it's a very nutritious starch. But we're very heavy into flours and highly processed refined carbohydrates and so on. And in these circumstances, we notice that in order to, one, try to curb our food import bill, two, educate the end user on what local produce there is, and three, encourage the growth of those particular foods. We had to educate them on literally like import substitution, understanding that you don't necessarily need pasta or imported food to make a lasagna pie or shepherd's pie. You could substitute that by using dasheen, which is more nutritious and so on. So in that case, we've started centering our approach on nutritional marketing so that, one, the end user understands, okay, I can use this locally produced food and it's actually good for me. And two, it also creates a market for the farmers and they themselves, it empowers they themselves to explain to their consumers, whether it's to a large scale buyer or even someone coming up to their market stall that, oh, you know, dasheen is really good for, it's really high in fiber, or, you know, moringa is very good for this as well. So yes, to answer your question, these are some of the approaches that we take.
Okay, yeah.
I thought I'd go with a negative example of where human-centered design has not been used until relatively recently, because it's illustrative of what needs to be done, and that's the train wreck that is clean cook stoves. So clean cook stoves are apparently a fantastic idea. So lots of people have serious health problems as a result of burning particularly wood in closed environments in low-income communities. So let's design a stove which will use a more ecologically viable material and which will reduce that particulates and therefore the health costs of that. Great idea. Most of the clean cook stoves are designed by engineers that really didn't think about their consumers, and they ended up, and most engineers, of course, are men, so they ended up with products which were technically superb and too expensive and not well designed, and for which you couldn't therefore build markets because they were an expensive product, so which required also a smart financial modeling. And so precisely because people hadn't paid attention to that, you tried first to create a market, and then when you couldn't create a market, international NGOs started giving them away, which then destroyed the market. But that has a limited track life and limited sustainability attached to it. And it's only subsequently that people have begun to think in terms of human design and think of, firstly, the consumer is primarily the woman in the household. They're interested both in efficiency but also in looks. So why would you buy a stove which looks ugly? You want to think about cost and how do you reduce cost to the absolute minimum, and to build those kinds. And it's only then you've begun to get into the marketplace designs of clean cook stoves. We've got one enterprise again in Kenya where the actual designer is a woman. She actually grew up in an informal settlement in Nairobi, has no technical education, but is an archetypal consumer. And she's actually come up with a stove which is a third cheaper than its rivals, even though it's actually manufactured in Kenya rather than mass produced in China. And it's been designed with the customer in mind, and therefore has now got traction, and she's selling a considerable number of these. But it's an illustrative example of how you can actually comprehensively trash a market if you don't think carefully about the design of your product, and who's going to buy it, and how they're going to buy it, and why are they buying it. Because you might assume that the health message is the one that's most powerful, but actually in this case the market message of cost was much more powerful than the health message.
Okay, yeah. Let's move on maybe to the next question, which is what challenges do social enterprises face? So maybe we'll go to Keithlin first. In terms of your own experience as a social entrepreneur, what are the main key challenges that you faced, and maybe how have you overcome them?
Sure. As I mentioned, in my region, social enterprise is a very new thing. So I think that one of the main problems is, number one, understanding the concept of social enterprise. The fact that it's still not a common thing in the Caribbean, approaching funders and so on, it's very difficult because they're still dabbling with what exactly are you. Another one of the problems with that is obviously, I would say the additional cost of building up a social enterprise. Sometimes people don't understand the amount that goes into overhead into trying to create like a strong, sustainable organization first, without giving it all out to our beneficiaries. I think sometimes in the Caribbean and Latin America, we have at times a mindset that there's an organization, if the, you know, it's supposed to do good and so on, then some of the easiest things might be just handing money out, perhaps, or just giving free trainings throughout the year without, you know what I mean, so without any end goal. And I think finally, let me see, like I said, I think that's really the largest things, is understanding what a social enterprise is, and then later on actually getting the funding or the right partners to actually partner with you and help to grow that type of enterprise. It's slowly changing, but we're still very much in the early stages, I would say, in the Caribbean.
Okay, yeah. Just as a follow-up question, like, do you have any challenges in terms of like maintaining your vision? Like, because you mentioned that it's difficult in terms of understanding what a social enterprise is, like maintaining your vision and your mission while you branched out and you created Green Gold, things like that. Like, how, talk me through how like that has been with your team and the rest of your staff as well.
That's actually a really great question. Because early on when we started the organization, we started off as Helen's Daughters, which was just a non-profit organization. And it was more so really an online social media advocacy organization, because we felt that, you know, rural women were looked at as literally invisible in the agricultural sector. And then we started really seeing the sustainability issues there, and we morphed into, and also hearing basically, I guess more so the demands of rural women, like, okay, highlight us, but also, you know, teach us, educate us, train us. Then we morphed into sort of, you would say, like some of our programs morphed into training programs, like I had mentioned earlier on, and so on, in sustainable agriculture, introducing them to agri-tech. And then really when we noticed, okay, we have these thriving training programs, but what are we going to do? What's the end goal with our farmers? Because we're equipping them with the knowledge and the tools to grow large scale, to become smarter growers and so on, but who are they selling to? And that was literally when we envisioned the social enterprise Green Gold, to sort of assist our farmers throughout the supply chain. So what we like to say is, from seed to plant, in that we teach you, for example, what to grow, what demands there are, the sustainable agricultural practices that exist, then also helping you to develop your agribusiness model, and finally, literally brokering contracts and introducing to large-scale buyers and so on. Now, I do have to mention that COVID-19 definitely helps you to change quite a bit and so on. For us, our social enterprise model was quite targeted at the tourism sector. Most of our farmers who have large-scale contracts, while they do have them with the supermarkets and so on, the majority of them were with the hotel sector because one, the hoteliers actually paid more for their product, and two, obviously they demanded more product. So it was, if you could say, a secure income every month compared to what they would go through selling at produce markets and so on. When COVID happened, literally all the hotels on island closed. So we had to quickly pivot our model, and we sort of took a fresh, direct approach. We noticed that there was quite a bit of families and so on who, for example, did not want to go outside, to go to the markets and get fresh produce. And we noticed that the supermarkets themselves were actually not buying fresh produce because of the rationing going on. So what we did was we created sort of like produce baskets, boxes, and we delivered them weekly to different families and individuals, because at the time when the hotels closed, we had some farmers who were stuck with like 2,000 pounds of lettuce or tomatoes and so on, and we needed to figure out, okay, how we can't allow all this hard work to go down the drain. How do we like pivot that and still assist the farmers who, in a way, were the hardest hit? They are entrepreneurs themselves. So how do we pivot that to really gain traction, keep these farmers receiving some type of income during these times, which is where we did the sort of home delivery and so on.
Okay, yeah. Now I'll go to Nicholas. I'll actually ask the same question, like in terms of the enterprises that you've worked with or the organizations that encourage enterprise development. What are the challenges in terms of maintaining that vision, like that social mission, while they're developing and growing in scale, and maybe gaining new customer groups? Like how do they, like what examples do you have in terms of these kind of challenges?
So one of the challenges is that often social enterprises have gone for trying to sell products and services to what is unfortunately called the bottom of the pyramid, only discover that the bottom of the pyramid can't actually afford to purchase your goods and services. And people have felt that's been a challenge to their mission, because their mission was, for example, let's say, put solar lamps in the hands of the poorest. And in point of fact, in order to build your business, your social enterprise, you first of all have to put solar lamps in the hands of not the poorest, but perhaps the near poor, or even the emergent middle class. So actually, because unless you've developed a viable business that's scalable and has a diversified customer base, you're never going to get to the point where you have the scale which provides economies of scale that reduces the cost of the product, so it actually meets your target group. And so I think one of the things you've seen has particularly been true in the sort of renewable energy space, and particularly sort of renewable energy consumer products, has been this need to have a much longer sense of what you're trying to do, and you're trying first of all to build a viable business that creates a marketplace for your product, and then only as you go to scale can you begin to think about putting those products in the hands of people with less disposable cash, because the price of the product has fallen successfully going forward. So how do you do that? And I think that's been several of the conversations we've had with some of our organizations to say, well, actually, perhaps you will start with a different customer base before you get to that point. I think that one of the challenges around COVID-19 has been that many of the best social enterprises who've been encouraged to ensure that their revenue base is driven by their customers rather than by external financing, and particularly by grant, have now discovered that they are actually in a more perilous situation than those that have significant resources that have been driven by grant. And so some of your best performers in the pre-COVID environment now find themselves the most challenged because their customers again have moved. I think that which also indicates the fragility, I think, in a number of marketplaces in which we work around what people assume to be the emergent middle class. It's remarkably quickly the emergent middle class disappear and retrench. And so your products and services, which precisely because they're trying to deliver social environmental good, have a certain price premium attached to them, disappears. So the person who would have gone to the cafe has now reverted to street food. The person who possibly would have bought one or more organic products, particularly for their children, no longer does so because the family has now an uncertain economic situation. So that's, and so what? How do you need to pivot? You know, how do you need to think about how to change the pricing of your product, your target market, and how then also to maintain your vision of producing something of quality if disposable income required to buy that quality is no longer available to you.
Okay, yeah, just another follow-up question. Another key challenge that a lot of social enterprises within our program face is just how to obtain funding. This kind of like what you guys mentioned as well. So there are a lot of concepts being thrown around, like things like patient capital. And since social enterprises often have a more unique model and it might take some time for them to scale up, maybe what are some of your recommendations in terms of how they can weather that storm before they can gain that significant investment to scale up? I'll address this to Nicholas first.
Yeah, the challenge around patient capital is enormous, and because the market has misjudged the growth rate of social enterprises. It's too dominated by kind of venture capital notion that you're going to get, you know, hockey stick like growth, and most social enterprises don't grow like hockey sticks. Hopefully they grow in sort of steady incremental stages. And so I think certainly at the outset, it is thinking about where are the resources of broadly free money, and the two sources of relatively what we'll call free money. One is the opportunity to get grants, and the other is to recognize that much of the revenue you're going to generate in order to enable it to grow is going to come from your own cash flow. So being really clear about the ability of your business model to generate cash flow to carry you across a much longer period than you probably imagine when you set out. Because depending on the market, the level of patient capital that's accessible varies very dramatically, and there isn't enough of it. So there's long conversations that the marketplace having about blended finance and how that reduces risk to investors, and people like us will take the first risk and other commercial investors will take the larger risk, but the market is mostly dysfunctional, and so And so one should never be proud about looking for grant money. You have to be clear, of course, the grant money is going to distort your business model rather than enhance it. So you find yourself chasing the next grant rather than trying to identify money which actually enhances where you want to go and go forward. And the second is to think very, very carefully about product price and cash flow, and give yourself the potential, at least, for long runway until you become an investable product for capital, which is distinctly looks like and is structured in a commercial way. Still maybe impact capital, but most impact capital is finance first, not impact first, and therefore it only comes when you have a genuinely mature commercial model.
Okay, I was wondering for Keithlin, like what, how has that been for you in your social entrepreneur journey in terms of this financial challenge? Did you face any of it?
Nicholas actually brought up some fantastic points. We're just going through something similar right now. We passed up on a grant opportunity. And as he mentioned, it was because at times, oftentimes, especially in a non-profit sphere, we're constantly looking for money, searching for money. But what we don't realize is that a lot of times, obviously that grant funding comes with strings attached. And oftentimes it does distort your organization. And I've seen for myself where some organizations, they start off with certain values and intentions, and it's completely different 10 years down the line. And I really would not like for our organization to be the same. So for persons who are literally just starting a social enterprise, and I'm really talking about beginning stages like us, which is, 4 years, not that long ago. For us, the first thing was, as we mentioned, we started off as a non-profit. So it was a lot of donations and in-kind donations and so on. When we came up with the social enterprise, our first major injection of money came through crowdfunding, which is a lot of times family, friends, and other persons who like the idea and want to see that idea thrive. And as I said, we maintain 2 separate organizations because of how St. Lucia is. So we do have we do receive certain grant funding for our training programs because those are completely free to our farmers and so on. But for our social enterprise, what we're literally doing is the money that we make, which is about 10% off of each order, we literally reinvest in our operations and so on. And like Nicholas said, I think we're literally trying to work up to a stage where we can apply for, get patient capital and so on. But right now, that has really been the thing that's, one, sustaining our objectives, our goal, and keeping us, I guess you could say, pure. And the other is being able to sort of like that, I guess that self-discipline in reinvesting in ourselves to get to a certain point where we can expand.
Okay, yeah, thanks both for your comments on this. I think we'll move on to the second team now. So before we kind of go into the questions, I just kind of wanted to get Nicholas to share a bit about Argidius's research as well as their approach towards enterprise development, because I think it's quite useful in us getting a perspective on how to evaluate the future for social enterprises and enterprises in general, small, medium enterprises. So maybe Nicholas, you could share your screen.
So yeah, so a quick sort of tour of the world of Argidius and how it fits into the social enterprise realities. So as Brandon said, Argidius is a family foundation, the family of the Brenninkmeijer family, who are the Netherlands' wealthiest family of entrepreneurs. They started small and growing business in 1843, so they're sixth generation of entrepreneurs. They now employ 65,000 people around the world and 1 million people in their supply chains. They're in retail, private equity, and commercial property. Argidius is one of their philanthropic entities. We focus on enterprise development, small and growing businesses, the reasons I mentioned, particularly around the focus on poverty reduction, and we're primarily focused on Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. And we have a kind of three-pillar strategy. All strategies have 3 pillars, so I'm told. So we have 3 pillars. So we have particular countries of interest where we're trying to build the ecosystem of business support development organizations. So that's incubators, accelerators, management training and development, business networks, and they're in Central America and in East Africa. We're looking at identifying within that market leading organizations which have the ability to go to greater scale and deliver services of greater quality in that marketplace, but there the geography is no longer relevant. So one of our global partners is Impact Hub, which provides co-working spaces and acceleration services for social enterprises, 104 impact hubs, I think now around the world, in both developed and developing markets. And finally, we want to learn what works and doesn't work in enterprise development. So what kind of assistance is the most effective assistance? How does that help the business grow, develop, move into its own future? And we've already mentioned some of these about the challenges of small and growing businesses, and about 20% of the businesses our partners have worked with over the last 6 years are self-described social enterprises. And that's about 2,000 social enterprises we've worked with over the last 6 years. We already mentioned access to finance and markets. We're interested, obviously, in access to knowledge. How do you help the strategy of the business? How do you help business business model, etc. Talent, which is something which is also important, because social enterprises often have the challenge that they can't afford to pay competitive salaries. If you want a financial manager in Nairobi, and you've got an alternative is to work with an established company, or perhaps have the security of working in government, why not do that? Why go work in a hopefully growing but still fragile and demanding social enterprise? And finally, how does the ecosystem fit together? What's the role of government? What's the role of finance? What's the role of the private sector in helping that happen? And we tend to focus on access to knowledge, talent, and finance in the work that we do. A couple of examples of businesses. Here's Uncommon Cacao, which is in Belize and Guatemala. It helps farmers grow organic cacao. It's sold into 2 companies in the US who have niche organic chocolate products, which are globally award-winning. They started with 150 farmers in their supply base. They've now got 2,500. They will have 3,000 by the end of this year. They're actually basically helping rebuild and reestablish the cacao farming industry in Guatemala and Belize. I have here 3 examples from Africa. Just pick out Matapal banana flour. The entrepreneur is the woman on everyone's right on the screen. Interestingly, she used to work for a bank, had her own plot of land, grew bananas, used to sell them to wholesaler, got a relatively low price for them, suddenly realized they could be turned into banana flour, set up a small factory. She again now has several hundred farmers supplying not only bananas but other products into her business, and she's left the bank and she's providing a guaranteed price as well as various other levels of support for the farmers that feed into her. here's an illustration of what an ecosystem looks like. This is what Guatemala looks like, did look like when we mapped it a couple of years ago. You'll notice, interestingly, that there's a bias towards providing services to ideation and startup. Governments particularly like ideation and startup because they can say, look, we started several hundred businesses, forgetting the fact that several hundred will also fail before year 3 is out. And so part of our responsibility has been to invest in organizations on the right side of that chart, which are interested in helping businesses once they've got beyond the stage of startup to consolidate, expand, and grow. And that map over the last 6 years has very definitely changed. 7 years ago, almost all the services were on the left-hand side. Some examples of the organizations we work with range from international NGOs like Technoserve to regional organizations like Agora, and many of which themselves are social enterprises. So many of the organizations that work with enterprises to be better enterprises are themselves social enterprises. So AMI over there on the right, the African Management Institute now provides online and offline management training services to businesses in sub-Saharan Africa. It too is a social enterprise, which has just completed its Series A of impact investors. I'll skip that one and I'll come to this one, which looks like a fairly complex chart. But one of the things we didn't know 6 years ago was, well, does any of this work? Does business incubation work? Does acceleration work? Aren't these services just good at choosing enterprises that are already on a growth trajectory, do stuff with them, they're still on a growth trajectory, but did they actually make a contribution to that growth and that development? And because we measure the same impact measures for everything we do, and we now have thousands of businesses and dozens of programs that we supported over the 7 years, we've been able to distill what you need to do as a business development agency to be successful in how you deliver what you deliver. And I won't go into all of this, but I will pick out a couple of things that are really important. So one is most people learn in response to a challenge or an opportunity. So most people who design learning programs, that small number of people who actually enjoy learning for its own sake. So there's a mismatch here usually. So usually programs have been designed which said, okay, you're an entrepreneur, you need to know these 10 things, and we're now going to teach you these 10 things that you need to know. Most of which went in one ear and out the other and didn't get applied. So it's called reverse curriculum, whereby you actually help an entrepreneur solve a real life problem. Let's say they have a real life problem with cash flow, you help them solve it, and then you reverse them into what they need to know in order not to have that problem again. So programs that do this have significantly better results than programs that are still simply curriculum based, which teach the 10 things an entrepreneur ought to know. Intensity matters. So again, you need to be able to apply your learning. So if your program is getting people to learn too much too fast, much of that will be lost because it isn't being applied. Again, a program, if it's not intense enough, i.e. if it's all too spread out, people will have forgotten key things by the time you've finished. So getting the right intensity of a program is very important. Charging for training is important. So charging entrepreneurs, even if it's not the full cost, it rarely is the full cost of the program, makes for better selection, both on the part of the organization delivering the training and also the participation of the entrepreneur going forward. And so we've built out, as we're working in development, we came up with obviously an acronym called SCALE. A lot more about this on our own website. But we now have programs that have taken SCALE, thought about what they do and how they do it, made often really simple adjustments, and have got significantly impressive, better results. So there's a program called BPEACE, which works in Guatemala and El Salvador. It just changed two things. It changed the fact that it was now going to charge its entrepreneurs participating in the program. Again, it was significant, but nominal to the cost of the program. And they changed the intensity. They actually made it slightly less intense so that entrepreneurs had enough time to actually put into practice what they were learning. And the results in terms of the incremental revenue of the businesses that they were working with in the cohort they applied the changes had doubled. So the businesses were getting growth rates that were twice on average, or on the median, twice to what had been true in the first program without those two changes. So these application actually kind of works. So that's kind of what we try and do. And of course we do it with others. We have other private foundations that fund with us, governments that fund with us. We share our learning as far as widely as possible. And we have one of the largest longitudinal databases of small enterprise and social enterprise performance anywhere in the world. And we were told last week, I'm pleased to say, that our data was much better than any development finance institution's data that they had seen. And that's also been a definite attempt to try and contribute to the ecosystem as a whole.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Nicholas. Yeah, I would just like to go back to Keithlin and ask you about your experience in terms of working with partners in the public sector as well as the private sector that have helped your social enterprise.
Okay, thank you so much, Brandon. In terms of partners with the public sector and private sector, first I would honestly say that when it came to the public sector, well, particularly for governments and so on, we weren't welcomed with open arms. We were sort of seen as a competing entity, particularly since in a way we had privatized agricultural extension services, especially for our training programs. I mean, I look at us as what I would say our organization can be is it can complement governmental entities like ministries of agriculture. When you look at, for example, in St. Lucia, one agricultural extension officer, he has to sometimes cater to 800 or 1,000 farmers. Whereas if you have a group that has a particular niche, especially focusing on gender-centric approaches to agricultural extension and focusing on recruiting and educating women farmers, I would look at that as a good partner. But that is not necessarily the attitude that we normally receive in our countries and in similar countries closer to home as well. In terms of the private sector, I would actually say that we've received much more support, particularly in entities like the St. Lucia Hotel and Tourism Association. For them, it was obviously a win-win situation because one, they were able to boost up their CSR profile in a way to show that they were actually contributing to supporting and getting sustainable incomes for rural women. But at the same time that they were actually getting access to organic, fresh, locally produced food. And it was easy. They didn't have to go to one farmer at a time, but they could actually go to like a cooperative-like system. And also it did help that we provided quality assurance and delivery and so on as well. And then finally, I would say in terms of public sector, more so the funding organizations and also the international organizations coming from the UN side. A lot of times, especially in UN agencies and so on, there's a very top-down approach. They go through governments and so on, and that is how they identify beneficiaries. And I've seen quite a few times, particularly in St. Lucia, where they develop models that, to be honest, at the end of the day, don't touch the beneficiaries that they get, and they're not sustainable. You see a project start, in 2010 and it ends in 2012. And when you really ask about the impact and so on, you don't really see that. That's why I'm not surprised that Nicholas said that his model was probably better than a lot of other international funders. I'm not really shocked at all. And yeah, so in a nutshell, I would say that has really been our experience.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to go back to something that Nicholas, you mentioned that I thought was quite interesting. So you talked about how many governments they actually focus a lot about in like very like large scale innovations, like they're trying to force out innovation in a way even. I'd like to know like what you think different players like yourself, people who are supporting the capacity and structures surrounding enterprises and social enterprises can do to create a shift towards favoring people who are not making like crazy innovations, but just modest innovations but very well placed interventions, like kind of shifting the whole stance and perspective to favoring these organizations more, these social enterprises as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I think getting governments to foster innovation is always a challenge. Getting governments to think about how they successfully and intelligently support other organizations to do that effectively and well is the goal, and it's a long-term goal. I mean, a good example would go back to Guatemala, which doesn't have a high functioning government with lots of resources, but which did want to, for example, provide business development services in each of its key regions in the country, and part of the conversation was persuading them to do that in such a way that they would be the provider of resources, they would be selecting the providers of service, they wouldn't be the deliverers of service, and the deliverers of service would be the business development organizations themselves, and what they would be, and it would be they which would be the source of innovation and delivering those services to the underlying entrepreneurs. And I think and that seems to be working. So that the government provided the resources to develop a central program in each of its main districts, and they've committed actually to quite a long period of funding in order to ensure that those resources continue to be made available, which then gives the often social enterprises who are delivering the services to those enterprises much greater flexibility and a greater sense of continuity to be able to support those services going forward. But that was a conversation that took, I'm going to say it actually took 2 governments in Guatemala. It took the best part of 6 years to have that conversation intelligently, and so it definitely, that's part of it, is a really long-term kind of thinking about, well, what are the levers of influence? And the challenge is that individual social entrepreneurs, individual providers of service, don't have that ability to influence government. And so you really do need also to think about, within the ecosystem, are the intermediary organizations that aggregate the interests of social enterprise and able to talk to the government. So there's a UK-based foundation which has done a lot of work in the renewable energy space in India and in East Africa, because the government had a legitimate problem. It wanted to talk renewable energy, but it didn't have anybody to talk to, and the individual social enterprises that were delivering last mile energy solutions didn't have the bandwidth or the space to engage the government. So what this foundation has done has been to support what are basically industry associations who can then carry on that conversation with the government about how do you create a better environment to support renewable energy solutions going forward, of which these social enterprises are a key component and part.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I still have other questions about like maybe more about accelerators, but I think we can go back to that in the Q&As. So we'll move on to the next question, which is how do social enterprises complement nonprofits and what factors allow for enterprise development? So I'd like to go to Keithlin for this. And please just share with us your experience in terms of Helen's Daughters and Green Gold, and maybe give us some context about how social entrepreneurship is seen in St. Lucia, as you have already introduced.
Thank you. I feel like that question is tailored to me. As I've said several times, we have two models. One is a nonprofit, Helen's Daughters, and the other social enterprise, Green Gold. And for me, the way that they complement each other, particularly in the ag sphere and so on, is that, for example, in St. Lucia, we're lacking a lot of agricultural education. Me, for example, I've grown up in a rural farming community and so on, but I've never actually been exposed to a formal agricultural education course until I left St. Lucia. So that's a problem, because we're asking to tackle the food insecurity problem. We're asking for farmers to ramp up their efforts, but we're not really educating them on how to do so. And 60 years ago, they were actually doing that. So for us, the Helen's Daughters part of it, the nonprofit organization, it complements the social enterprises that in one, it provides training program, which is at no cost to female farmers. Two, it really elevates the space for female farmers. We've sort of tried to create like a support network between the mentors and facilitators that are in the training program and the farmers themselves. And in St. Lucia, I also feel like that there is also this social balance that takes place in the nonprofit, in the sense that the mentors and the facilitators, St. Lucia is we have issues with class. The mentors and facilitators are from, I guess you see, the upper middle, upper class and so on, and the farmers are, you know, a bit poorer and stuff. So it gives them that opportunity to actually foster relationships with persons that they would probably have never been in a room before. And they're learning from those persons. And I think the beautiful thing about the training programs also is that they have firsthand experience. It's not, for example, some expert from outside who's giving agricultural education on tailoring the demand or how to produce your crops or whatever. It's actually persons who work in those spheres. And how that nonprofit complements us, for example, is where the social enterprise comes in. It's that after you've done this training program, whether it's for 6 months to a year, and your business model has been tailored, your knowledge is better, your growing practices have improved, now you can actually sell to a large-scale producer, and you don't have to worry about going to this person and so on. That you know, we've put in place systems where you can easily broker contracts, whether it's with hotels, restaurants, the supermarkets and so on, so that the end result is that you find a woman who was selling at a market stall and probably bringing in about 400 US a month or so, and she now is actually bringing in like 1,000, 1,100 US dollars a month. So it's a significant change, and you find literally that it's not only the knowledge that has improved, but also their livelihoods, which obviously trickles down into families and so on. And I think I answered your question, Brandon.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, now we'll go to Nicholas. Just wanted to know, are there any examples they have for people who have worked with Argidius? Any non-profits that have successfully started social enterprises, or like a profit branch of a business, like branch of their operations? And also, are there any non-profits that have no business to be starting social enterprises? Yeah.
The way in which non-profits and social enterprises mesh is multiple. But we certainly have examples of organizations that started as not-for-profits and have actually morphed into for-profits. I mean, one good example from Kenya was an organization that interestingly started a not-for-profit for child safeguarding. So how to support organizations to ensure that children would be safe within those institutions. And they actually realized that they could turn themselves into an effective consultancy which would charge fees to schools, to nurseries, to various institutions to provide the training and support that appropriate child safeguarding would require. And so their original model was to think of this as a not-for-profit offering, which turned into a consultancy, which has become quite a vibrant business activity in its own right, in a very specialized area in this case. So there are good examples of that. Of course, there are good examples of where the ability of the social enterprise to operate and to develop its model has been supported by not-for-profits. So if you took someone like Root Capital, which is one of the largest agricultural impact lenders in Latin America and Africa, they would never have been possible. They'd never have developed that model to commerciality if not-for-profits had not helped them develop that model, help them create a blended finance model which enables them to absorb a certain amount of risk, and to be able slowly to demonstrate to more commercially minded lenders that there were certainly sectors of the agricultural market to which you could lend. So the two working in harmony together was good. Not-for-profits who probably shouldn't be in the social enterprise space, I'm afraid generalist international NGOs, one of which I used to work with, because the culture is different. And the culture for an international generalist NGO is very much how do you work with the poorest and most marginalized, and the culture around enterprise is how do you develop a successful enterprise model which at some point will get to have an impact on the poorest and most marginalized, but doesn't necessarily start there. And these two things are in tension. Just yesterday, I was having a conversation with an alliance between a business development support organization and international NGO. And the tension in the program was, well, we want you to seek out enterprises in the most remote rural areas you can find. And the business development service saying, well, yes, we want to be able to do that, but we also want to be able to deliver a successful intervention. And so they were having to work that out, and they were working it out creatively, but often because there were two organizations, but often if that conversation is only being held in the international development organization, it skews towards giving help rather than thinking about a business model which might deliver help. And all of these organizations don't have an institutional memory. So CARE is a good example. So CARE started both business development services and impact investing. They realized it couldn't sit within CARE, so they spun it off 20 years ago. It became SEEF and SEED, both of which are very successful organizations, one of which we work with. It's currently in the process of reinventing enterprise development and impact investing within itself. And you just think, well, that's not going to work for exactly the same reasons that they spun out SEEF. So yes, if they are incubators of these kinds of activities, they should think of them as something that they're incubating and that they're going to spin off, not something they're going to keep within their organizational culture, because their organizational culture is not designed to be able to support that intelligently.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I think we'll move on to the last question. So both of you have been very heavily involved with social entrepreneurship and also non-profits. So I would just like you guys to know, to just answer in terms of for the students in the chat. What are some opportunities that they can take hold of to get to know more about the social sector, the third sector, and how did you guys kind of start being involved in this sector? Yeah. Maybe we can start with Keithley.
Okay, sure. I will start out by talking about how I got involved and then the opportunities available. I actually started hearing about social enterprise while at the UN. There was certain panels that I would be on, and I started noticing the trend of hearing constantly about social enterprise because I wasn't hearing about that at all in my region. Then I attended a panel with Professor Yunus, and then saw his host the social enterprise model in India and Pakistan and other areas. So I got interested there. And I just started seeing the balance that it presents for a lot of countries, and the burden that it can take off a lot of third world country governments, particularly if they actually instituted creating relations with those sort of organizations. And then I would say that I wish I knew about social enterprise earlier on. I think for young people, particularly for persons who are definitely into international development and so on, like myself, normally you think that the UN is the first place to go, and it is a great experience. But a lot of times, do not quote me. Sometimes it can be a lot of paper pushing. And you don't really get to see that real type of impact and have a bit of influence. And I would say that honestly, if you want impact and influence straight out of university and so on, social enterprise and getting involved with it would definitely be the way to go. I think that one, there's a lot of established social enterprises that one could provide that training and growth that you probably would not get in the traditional job sector. Two, you would really get your hands dirty. You would really get to see the impact. You would get to see the ups and downs of what it takes with a social enterprise, and you would get to see a broad spectrum of things. Like, for example, with us lobbying governments on domestic agricultural policy, there's quite a bit of interesting things that you can actually experience in the social enterprise sector. And I think that one of the things that I would honestly suggest is that if you are into international development, international relations and so on, yes, you can think of the UN, but definitely think of social enterprise. If you can get into an internship now, a volunteership or something, do it. I think that also right now, because of COVID and before that, a lot of the, now it escapes me, but there are quite a bit of virtual programs that teach you about social enterprises, whether you want to start one or whether you want to get involved as well. And finally, too, I think that a lot of social enterprises need like the vision of young persons, particularly in shaping our narrative. I think that in the nonprofit sphere, we're not very good at shaping a narrative and attracting a lot of supporters and so on. And I think that's a space where as young persons, we are able to, particularly social media and so on, able to hatch onto. So there's a lot of, or whether you're a technical expert and so on, I think there's just a lot of room for innovation and room for young innovation in social enterprise. Thanks, Brandon.
So I tend not to start with my story because it's so weird. Because basically the United States government gave me $3 million and let me go to Eastern Europe and start a small enterprise bank, without me really knowing what I was doing. So that's probably not the sort of obvious career path that people get. And I still to this day am not quite sure how that transpired. But anyway, but I will use one of my team's good examples, which was Yeah, I think the whole point about a social enterprise is that particularly in its relatively earliest, well, either in its earlier stage, but really that early stage can go on for, as I said, for quite some time. It always has capacity constraints. So, so if you have a appropriate, relevant skill, and that doesn't have to be hugely skilled, and you can be genuinely useful, you can often find social enterprises which will be very happy to provide you with space in which to help them and for you to learn. So if I took Harry as an example, he's somebody who works with me. After university, he scratched up enough money to go to Uganda, basically, and he looked around and he volunteered, in this case, for a financial inclusion institution. And he had two crucial things that they needed help with. One was he could help them with their financial modeling, and he had a degree of social capital back in the UK, so he could begin to make connections with potential funders stroke investors. And he was still quite young at that stage, and that gave him a runway into this space. He then actually went back and worked for one of the big four accountancy firms, actually, in their sustainability practice in PwC, and then we picked him up to work around our processes of evaluation and monitoring. And now he's set fair for a career in this space. He could probably go and do anything he wanted, really. And so I think it's recognizing that if you have a useful set of skills, and if you have the space and ability to develop an internship where you can contribute those skills to social enterprise, you are a very significantly good commodity, because there's always this lack of capacity. And whether that's in in the sales and marketing direction, whether that's in the financial modeling direction, whether that's bringing a particular kind of social capital because you have connections into more developed markets, all of those are really useful skills that you can make use of, and yeah, just turn up, really. It's particularly true. I mean, I think in East Africa, no, I think it's also true in Central America. You just come across people who have, saved up enough money to give them a bit of a runway. They turn up. They either have their own idea, which is sometimes true, to start a social enterprise, which is fine, or they find somebody who's had an idea and needs help, and just go and be helpful. Because if you do it in the right way and you have the ability to provide that capacity, you're a gold nugget in a like I say, gold nugget in a sparse forest. But that's a terrible mix of metaphors. So I'll shut up at that point.
Okay, thank you, guys. Just on the topic of students and youths and what they're doing for social enterprises, we also have a few organizations to share. Yep. So the first one is Regional Relief. So it's actually a youth-led campaign by a few third years and graduates from the University of Cambridge. And what they did was actually build a database of more than 27 COVID-related charities in Southeast Asia. They identified a gap in terms of data and also information that was surrounding COVID for Southeast Asia. And in general, there is a research gap in Southeast Asia. And that's why they're trying to fulfill this gap. And recently, they started to use this database to start a fundraising sprint to invite students to take part and join in the fundraising campaign, which you can access in this QR code. And the next one is actually Campstart, which is a Youth Social Enterprise Academy and Accelerator. And it's actually starting in 1st September. So for any of the participants here in this chat who are looking to start a social enterprise or just understand a bit more about the kind of thought that goes into and the mental models that go into social enterprise thinking, you can always join by clicking on that QR code there, and just to understand more about Campstart. And also my email is there. If anyone wants to get involved with BfE, in terms of joining as a consultant to work with inspiring social entrepreneurs like Keithlin, and yeah, working in any other capacity with BfE in terms of our outreach to our partners and accelerators globally. Yeah, okay. I think with that, we'll move on to our Q&A portion, opening up to the floor. Yeah, so we will, I think since there's not that, I think there's enough people here, so we can just start the Q&A here. And if anyone wants to speak up, just switch on your mic and talk. But if you're not comfortable doing so, you can just put down your question in the chat in that format. Maybe not so formal, that's fine as well. But and I will help you to ask that question. Yeah. Yeah, but if not, I'll just get the ball rolling because I just had a question from previously. You mentioned that for accelerators, and I'm asking Nicholas for this question. For the accelerators that you were looking at in your research initiative, you found that it was very useful to monetize and to charge enterprises for the services. And I also have had this conversation with another of the fund managers from Argidius, Harry. So we were talking about bridges for enterprise and whether we should consider like charging a price for our enterprises. And I think I just wanted to get to know what would be a good stage to do this, just because we have been following the model of pro bono for like about 5 years, and also how you would go about doing it in terms of the case studies that you have seen before. Yeah.
Yeah, charging is an interesting one. So I think that the rules about charging are really quite relatively simple. I mean, I think that you're offering a meaningful good to an entrepreneur, you hope, and that should have some kind of value attached to it. The value should be real, even if it's nominal. So, but I mean that you're not aiming necessarily to cover the costs of your intervention, but it's a meaningful sum to the entrepreneur. And of course, the meaningful sum depends where the entrepreneur is. So, I mean, if they're at the earlier stages, that fee can be relatively small. If they're further down the line and developed revenue streams and so on, it can be larger. It does various things. It seems to do various things. So one is it clearly creates a sense of this is a professional, intelligent transaction where we are going to provide you with a valued service. So we value the service. The entrepreneur is going to think about it and say, okay, well, I value doing this, and having done this, my commitment to the program is probably going to be greater. And that's one of the things we definitely notice, that entrepreneurs who've paid turn up more regularly, more attentively, and in a more engaged way. And so there's clearly a recognition that in most cases, the cost of delivery is much greater than the charge. And it's not about trying to create a revenue stream for yourself always. Sometimes it is. Some interventions, AMI, which I mentioned earlier, is looking to become a profitable model for delivering its kind of management training to enterprises. But it's not there yet. But for most cases, it's saying, look, this is a serious transaction. And are you seriously selecting to participate in this program? Are you, the provider of this program, serious about what you're providing? And it's a good kind of signaling mechanism. It's not as simple as saying, you know, people only value what they pay for, which is clearly untrue because people value all kinds of things they don't pay for. But it's a good signaling mechanism. And again, we've got a series of programs that have basically done that and often got fewer applicants, interestingly, but much better quality applicants to their program. So, you know, the evidence is there. Harry, obviously, my colleague, can talk about it much more greater detail than I can, but the evidence is there that it seems to work and seems to be important. And when do you introduce it? Well, ideally you introduce it when you start, but you introduce it at any point in the program when you now are convinced it makes a difference.
Okay, thanks. Just looking around the chat to see if there's any questions.
I can ask a question, Brandon. So my name is Annie, and I am the president of Bridges for Enterprise New York. And my question is more for Nicholas, but I guess if both of you have insights, I'd definitely welcome it. But I think in the philanthropic and social sector, we see a lot of like the rise or like talk about the rise of foundation related investments like PRIs and MRIs. And so I guess to what extent do you see that being a trend in the sector, and how can I guess foundations get better at leveraging that as a resource to target social entrepreneurs?
So it's definitely a trend. It's still more a North American trend than a European trend or an Asian trend. It has several challenges attached to it. So one is, are you genuinely doing program-related investment or mission-related investment, and are you an impact-first investor? So the primary concern is to enable the investee to reach the scale and address the social environmental problem challenge that it's set out to do. Or are you interested in financial return? So which money are you using? So are you using the income from your investment portfolio and using it instead of grant? And are you clear you're doing that? And are you clear that you're taking significant risk that might not work and your money may not return to you? And or are you doing it for financial return reasons? And I think that, and you should never try and do both. So because financial return will always trump impact. So unless so when we make an investment, for example, we're making it out of our grant budget, out of our money that we've deliberately designed for philanthropy, and we have already written it off. So even if we're structuring it as an investment, we're structuring it in the best possible way to enable that organization to achieve its impact goals. We are not structuring it in the best possible way for us to achieve a financial return, at the same time securing a successful business outcome. And the number of people who don't understand the difference between those two is significant, and it causes a great deal of confusion. And I think that the part of our task is, as foundations who do this, is to be much clearer about the distinction between impact first investing and financial return investing with an impact lens. And they're two very different things. And is it going to rescue social enterprise from this significant patient capital, long-term investment space? Not anytime soon, I'm afraid. In terms of the level of resources that are likely to be devoted to that, and the gap and the need for social enterprises. So you're back to, okay, so how am I going to utilize grants, and how am I going to utilize my own capital to secure my outcome, rather than expecting that this particular impact first space is to grow significantly, because it's not. I mean, it's growing, but very incrementally and very slowly, and has still got multiple model problems relating to it.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Nicholas. There's a question here from Ethan. He wants to know about how social enterprises are measuring and evaluating the impact of their programs. I think we've talked a bit about this in our conversation, but maybe we could discuss a bit more about impact metrics, like what are the key impact metrics you're using. And maybe we'll go to Keithlin first.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Ethan, for the question. For us, what we like to do before we like to target be specific about the districts that we target and so on. And what we like to do is create sort of like a baseline survey. So find out, for example, the income of the household, whether, because we focus on rural women farmers, find out, for example, if it's a single parent family, the size of the household, their output agriculturally, and so on. And then we look at, for example, what their goals are, their objectives, their aims of the training program. And at the end of the training program, we evaluate where they're currently at, what the income currently is, and so on, and compare that to the beginning baseline survey. So there for us, one of the things of evaluating impact is definitely the difference in income. Another also is the output in terms of what they actually produce agriculturally. Has it grown to scale and so on? And also, we also like to look at certain metrics when it comes to the household. For example, are they afford to send their children to certain schools? Can they afford to get a new vehicle? Like certain additional resources that they've actually obtained. And from there, we sort of use that case model for every training program that we run.
For us, we have three basically proxy indicators for the business's growth and development, and their incremental revenue, their full-time employment generation, and their capital raised. So is the business raising capital? Is the business growing in terms of revenue, and is it creating employment? And we did that because we wanted three impact indicators for the business, which most businesses should know, and which were relatively easily collectible. Because the challenge, obviously, of measuring impact is can you get the data, and what does it mean? I think in general, when it comes to social enterprises, our advice is always less is more. So think carefully about what's the smallest number of indicators you need in order to tell an intelligent story about the impact you're having. Because every indicator you collect is a cost. It's a cost both on you as the enterprise, but it's also a cost on the person you're collecting it from. So there was a program, which one of the few programs we actually stopped funding midway through, which had sort of 30 plus indicators of success, and actually the business consultant was spending more time collecting indicators than actually helping the business consulting the business. So, and if you have 30 indicators, you can always find one that's doing really well. So you can also tell yourself how wonderful you're doing, because that one's going really, really well, even though the other ones are actually probably not doing so well. So thinking carefully and trying to align what you want to know as an enterprise, what you want to know as a funder or an investor, with what the person who you're actually trying to help, the end client, the end beneficiary, would actually like to know about themselves. So you make it as unextractive as you possibly can, and as it's easy as they possibly can for everybody involved. Otherwise, the other challenge is that the data doesn't get collected, and so you actually don't know what your impact is.
Okay, thanks. We had another question. So the question is, the UN has estimated that the economic fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic set back global development by decades, and this will be very pronounced in emerging economies. So how can social entrepreneurs kind of respond to this and accelerate the recovery from this global crisis? Yeah, maybe we'll go to Keithlin first.
I really love that question, because I look at it as, for example, in the midst of a crisis, there's always there's always windows of opportunity. And particularly for the islands, for the Caribbean, I think that it really was a wake-up call for us. We were too over-dependent on the tourism sector. And I believe that COVID-19 shook us up, and particularly being involved in the ag sector, it made us realize, one, how important food security is, two, that there is actually a local market that can contribute significantly to our GDP, so that we don't necessarily have to focus all the time on bringing in for an investment, which is important, but we also have to have maintain a balance. And I think, for example, like I mentioned, St. Lucia in the UK actually had links to exporting bananas to the UK, and it was like our green gold era. And back in the 60s and 50s, it was contributing close to like 100 million, which is not that significant, but for a small island nation, it is to our economy. Now, agriculture is barely bringing in tens of millions of dollars, and we're completely focused on the tourism sector. So what do you do now with COVID-19 when travel has changed forever? Luxury travel has definitely changed. So what do you focus on? And I think that social enterprises like ourselves gives us the opportunity to, one, contribute to the economic diversification of Sydney economies, especially in the Caribbean. It gives us a chance to really look at the weaknesses in our systems, in our countries, and to really attack on that. I'll give you an example, two examples. One for agriculture. We've been lobbying about food insecurity issues, about food importation and so on for about 4 years. And literally when COVID-19 happened, it was just this burst of agricultural entrepreneurs on the stage, which we were quite happy about because it sort of boosted the local economies and so on. Two, it created a space for persons, for example, that were once unemployed, like overnight from the hotel industry. Now they have a space to actually be business owners and bring in some type of cash flow into their households. And finally, it focused on, again, our food insecurity issues, our issues of nutritional value and so on. And yeah, so it definitely presented a lot of opportunities, I would say, and I think that social enterprises right now, like, I think we need to notice that, I'm speaking on an island context, it could be a global context as well, Nicholas can correct me, but for us, I look at it as dividing, for example, community issues versus national issues. Government intervention, I feel like, should focus on national issues a lot of the time. And for example, food security issues can start at a small level, can start at the community level. And that is where I believe that social enterprises can really be transformative and where I've seen that change. And obviously, if you're replicating that throughout several communities, then it reaches to the national stage. So it's definitely now, I think now is the time for social enterprises to flourish. I think that we have a lot of opportunities, and I don't think that the outlook is as grim as a lot of outlets are allowing us to believe.
Yeah, yes, I mean, I agree. I think we it certainly gives a salutary shock. Particularly, I mean, food security is a really good one. So again, go to East Africa. You have two very different countries, very similar and very different countries, Uganda and Kenya. And Kenya now has to work out why it's so bad at agriculture. So, because it shouldn't be, and a significant portion of its food has come from Uganda. That was disrupted. It's now flowing again, but it's given the opportunity for people to begin to think about, so what does food security look like in the Kenyan context, and what are the roles that organizations need to play, enterprise needs to play, social enterprise needs to play, government needs to play, different levels, different contexts. and there's a a real opportunity to begin to rethink what that looks like. I think COVID also has demonstrated that there needs to be more work done about projecting social enterprise as a contribution, as a solution, and that does require a degree of collective action. So it can't just be individual social enterprises promoting themselves. It has to be networks of social enterprises, trade associations, social enterprises, that next tier up. Because I mean, I've sat in a number of global forums. WEF is hosting one at the moment, and the Schwab Foundation. And one of the things you've noticed is everybody going, well, nobody notices us, and we're a solution, and you think, okay, so actually, this is a call to collaborate more deeply and more effectively together to create a much stronger narrative about the contribution that social enterprise has to play in development. And it can't just be carried by any one individual player. So I hope that out of this will come alliances, mechanisms for telling the story more intelligently and collaborating more effectively. And I think it also does bring us back to the question we've already touched on, which is the access to financing of social enterprises, because that's quite broken. And some of the development players who ought to be in that space, development finance institutions, aren't, and also don't really understand social enterprise and its opportunities and possibilities. So there's a whole opportunity there to begin to retell a more effective impact story, which will get people hopefully to begin to think about, well, what do the financial structures look like which are needed in order to be able to help social enterprises scale and build that over time. So so we're having this conversation with the UK Department for International Development about its next impact market program and why it needs to think about building more effective market ecosystems for social enterprise rather than simply imagining that those ecosystems are already in place, which they're not. So there's all those sorts of things to be done, particularly at the advocacy level, to help organizations get the resources they need to scale effectively in order to do more.
Okay, yep. Thanks for your answers. I think that's all the questions we have. So thank you both for your time in sharing your experience in social entrepreneurship. I think all the participants learned a lot. And thanks everyone for taking the time to just attend our BfE webinar.
Can I just say, Brandon, before everyone goes, I just want to say thank you to BfE for the support and also to your efforts, Nicholas, in aiding other social enterprises worldwide. I think that it's a very lonely road, particularly in regions where it's not very well recognized or understood. And I have to say that BfE has literally helped us in our trajectory in organizing our structure and our efforts. So for those participants who are not maybe a part of BfE, who want to be a part of it and so on, I think it's a worthwhile initiative. And I just have all my gratitude and my thanks goes to the BfE family. You guys are really assisting and supporting and transforming social enterprises. And Nicholas, I mean, from the framework that you showed, I can only imagine the impact that you're creating. So thanks to support networks like you, I don't think social enterprises would really thrive. So that's really important to me.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, with that, I think we'll just end the webinar here. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Thanks so much.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye.